Right. So as we kind of move into the second half of our time today, you may have seen Eric's comment in the chat that this little section is being recorded, this section being just where I'm kind of presenting this section 2. And then we're going to go back into breakout rooms and do some more discussing specifically around building a toolbox together, talking about what methods or what tools we're or you're using or interested in using. Before we move into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how we can think about methods, right? We talked about methods and measuring outcomes in our second session, our second webinar together. But we really focused in on some pre and post measures and some survey validated scales that we can use. And of course, those are wonderful. But some of the things that really need to be considered when choosing our methods, choosing the tools that we have in our research toolbox and which ones we will use for measuring outcomes, we need to think about more than just what's validated or what's something I can implement pre-post to get a quote unquote validated or scientific measure of something I want to measure, an outcome I'd like to measure. Some of the things that we need to think about, the things that drive our methodological decisions, the decisions about what tools we use, are things like capacity, feasibility, our access to resources, the needs of both the project and the evaluation, and the audience, as well as what are our overarching measurement goals. So to get us started, I'm going to talk about a few of these factors. Specifically, I'm going to focus in on capacity, feasibility, and needs. Again, some of the things that drive our decisions about what methods do we want to use or what methods can we use, feasibly speaking. How can we measure our outcomes beyond just sort of validated scales, which is so far really all we've kind of talked about. So for capacity, over on the far left of this slide, we really need to look at the capacity that exists within your project, within your organization or your specific project, for either using or adapting specific methods for your needs. So this can include asking questions such as, first of all, what methods can be added to activities that we're already doing? So our data collection, engaging or implementing our methods, doesn't have to always be a unique activity, right? So there are things that you're already doing in administering or implementing your project. And sometimes collecting data can kind of piggyback on some of those activities. And that can help with some capacity issues. If we don't have the capacity or our participants don't have the capacity to really take part in separate evaluation activities. So for an example here, are there existing group conversations that happen within your project's activities that can be developed into a focus group for the purposes of data collection? Or are there already some short surveys being administered for other purposes, for example, quality assurance or other reporting that you can add to your overall evaluation purpose? So can you add some questions that meet up to meet your evaluation needs or your evaluation questions? That would be examples of piggybacking on things that we're already doing. A second capacity related question that we need to ask is, do we have the trained staff available to administer the methods that we want to use for our evaluation? Different kinds of methods, different kinds of research tools require different skills to administer. So for example, an online survey, administering an online survey might just be a matter of sending out a link. Of course, then we also have to think about analysis of the data we're going to get and what capacity we have for that. However, with something like one-on-one interviews with key stakeholders or service users, that might require a staff member who has some skill, knowledge, and training in interviewing skills. So to administer that method, rather than just sending out a link to an online survey for an interview, we'd really have to make sure we have the capacity within the organization to administer interviews, to engage with the qualitative one-on-one interviews. Similarly, if we want to do arts-based methods, we need to ensure that the people using the method or administering the method have the skills needed to engage in the art making, whatever the modality of art making is for your given arts-based methods, as well as other data collection processes to do that method. For example, an arts-based method might involve creating art, but also facilitating group conversations about what that art means. So we need to think about, do we have the capacity and the trained staff to administer, to do those methods? And then finally, the third question we might ask that relates to capacity is, to what degree can we involve service users in choosing and administering our methods? Are there existing opportunities to have service users or participants take part in administering the methods? For example, co-facilitating a focus group with a staff member or an evaluator. Or is there some kind of pre-training needed if we do want to involve service users or participants in that data collection and using the method? Is there some additional training that needs to take place there? Next, we move on to feasibility. So one of the first questions we need to ask there is, essentially, do we have access to the resources we need in order to use the methods that we intend to use? So for example, if we're wanting to use an arts-based method for our evaluation, do we actually have the needed art modalities? If we want to do photo voice and ask participants to take photos of their experiences, do we have the ability to give them access to digital cameras if they don't already have that access? Or if we're working with a community that maybe doesn't have access to smartphones, can we actually do photo-based methodology? Do we have access to a large space in which we can facilitate multiple focus groups at the same time, or an art making method? Do we have digital recorders to record the conversation? Second question related to feasibility is, do we have access to the population that we want to administer our methods to? This one came up a little bit in my small group in the first breakout rooms. So for example, we might be interested in knowing why people don't use the service that we're providing, or why people are not engaging with the service. Who are we missing and why are we missing them? But asking that question might be outside of the scope of what we can actually measure, because how do we administer our methods to people who we don't have access to, right? We want to know why we don't have access to particular groups or communities, but how do we even access them to ask those questions? Maybe that's outside of the reach of our evaluation. We may need to ask ourselves, what audience do we actually have access to? Are we already interacting with, for example, with parents on a regular basis? And if so, could we ask them to complete a short survey about their child's outcomes, whether it's around coping skills or development, as part of an existing interaction or an existing conversation that we're having with that particular audience, in that case, parents? And then, do we have the skills needed to gather and analyze the data? So for example, some validated skills need to be scored and analyzed using quantitative software. And this isn't always feasible in terms of accessing software, as well as accessing the skills needed to process and analyze the data we get from our methods. So instead, we may consider using methods that lend themselves to analysis that's based on the existing skills of the team, whoever the team is that's engaging with your evaluation or planning your evaluation. So for example, maybe someone on your team is very adept at thematic analysis, and so you decide to use qualitative methods because you have someone who can process and analyze the data that you'll get from doing those methods. And then finally, the last feasibility question here is, what time frame is needed for us to use this method? This also came up a little bit in our small group discussion. Maybe others had this come up too, but for example, is a pre-post survey needed in order to really understand the effect of your program? And of course, by pre-post, I mean collecting data, giving out your survey before your activities happen, before your participants take part in any kind of intervention. And then you do your intervention or your activities or your project. And then at the end, you do the same measure, the post measure, and then you can compare the pre and the posts. But we need to ask, do you have the time needed to collect that pre-data with enough time to elapse before we're collecting the post data? So do we actually have the time frame needed to do a pre-post survey design? And if not, then maybe it's not feasible to do that to use that kind of method. We may instead consider using a snapshot, or what we call a cross-sectional method, where we're taking a point in time assessment and not comparing pre and post, to get a more in-depth understanding of the experience that our service users are having in real time. And then finally, we have this category of needs, which will also dictate what kind of methods we can or should use. And this refers to the needs of the project and the needs of the evaluation. This requires looking at your study questions and really defining clear study questions to get an idea of what information do you need to know and for which audience. So asking what study questions are you trying to answer and what methods lend themselves well to answering those study questions. Asking what story do you need or want to tell about your project and to whom do you need or wish to tell it. Answering these questions will help facilitate how we collect that data, how we ask for people's stories, and how we report or analyze those. And then finally, how will you disseminate your findings, or how will you use your findings? So for example, if you want your findings to be usable for a broad audience, you may consider using a mix of quantitative and qualitative methods, or collecting quantitative and qualitative data, so that you can share overall trends and you can get some more in-depth data about the experience, or those quotations from participants telling their story to highlight their main points and their main story in terms of using the service or engaging with your project. So lots of things to consider when we're deciding what methods we can, should, or need to use for our evaluations. So I just want to quickly go over, I know these slides are a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot of information here, but something we're going to do in the second breakout room is kind of build a collective toolbox of methods. So I wanted to get us starting and thinking about what am I talking about when I say methods, when I say a collective toolbox, what are some examples? This is by no means a complete list. Here we have just some qualitative methods. The next slide will be quantitative methods that we might want to draw on. So when we get to the breakout rooms, you may discuss some of the things that are here, or you may add to what's here in terms of methods that you're using that I haven't even listed here, or just methods that you're interested in learning more about, but maybe haven't decided to use. This is by no means a complete list of qualitative methods, but it's a pretty thorough collection of different tools that we might use in qualitative approaches. And some of these may be more or less familiar to folks. So I'm happy to take questions when we get to the report back after our breakout rooms. So there's just a few here that I wanted to go into a little bit of detail on what they might mean in terms of usability and feasibility. And the first one here is document review. So there may already be documentation that results from doing your project or doing your activities. So for example, policy documents, program descriptions, etc. And some of these documents can really serve as data in and of themselves, when they're laying out, for example, how a program is intended to run, how a program is running, if we're looking at process more than outcomes, for example, or perhaps service users have created some form of documentation during their time in your project. And there may be a use for a reason for treating that documentation as data in order to minimize the burden of collecting new data from your participants. We can look at what we already have in terms of documentation. Another example here is mural making, and this is an example of a data collection tool that can serve multiple purposes. This is an arts-based method where participants are creating a mural together. And co-creating a mural that represents participants' experiences within your program, along with often some recorded group discussions where participants talk about the meaning of the mural and what they contributed and how it tells the story of their experiences. This can help you understand both the outcomes for participants of engaging with your program, so you're getting some evaluation data needs met. But at the same time, the mural making process itself can serve as a really great project or activity that may serve some of your overarching mandate or goals of your project, like some of the outcomes you're also seeking to engage with, like bringing people together to create art. Well, with the process of that will have its own impact on people. And then finally, the mural that's being created from using this method can be a really great tool for sharing about your project with a broader audience. Whether that's on social media or within your organization, you hang the mural up. You've created now a product that can help share the story of your your project or your activities. And I'm going to skip over storytelling here because I have a feeling this one might come up when we go into our breakout rooms, and I want to make sure we get to the quantitative methods here as well. So similar to the previous slide, this is sort of just a collection of quantitative methods. I'm not going to go over each one. We often think of surveys as like one quantitative method, but you might notice from looking at this slide that lots of these things are just different ways of using surveys, and each one is a different method of using surveys. So surveys themselves are really multiple different kinds of methods. So something to highlight here is this idea of rapid evaluations. So with a rapid evaluation, we're kind of just using these when we may have an audience that we're serving with our program or intervention that we may not see again. Like maybe we can't do a pre-post because maybe your activity is a drop-in based and you have different participants every time. And so maybe at the end of each time you offer that drop-in session or that drop-in group, you just take 3 to 5 minutes and do a very quick rapid evaluation. This can be giving people a QR code to answer 2 to 3 questions on their phone, or literally handing out small note cards that just have quick questions on them. This isn't going to give you extremely in-depth data, but it can still provide data to give you an idea of what more data do we need to collect. Maybe we need to do some supplemental qualitative methods to supplement what we were learning from these rapid evaluations. But it does allow you to capture data from participants you may just be interacting with once or twice, and maybe you can't do that comparison in terms of like pre-post surveys. So I want to give us a really quick example. I'm short on time here, so I'm just going to give a snapshot, but really the purpose of this is to give you an idea of, to give you an example of evaluation that I was coordinating back in 2018 to 2020. We wrapped up just before COVID, all of our data collection, which worked really well. Just to talk a little bit about how we creatively used various different methods and kind of a little bit about what worked in doing this evaluation. So the program that we were evaluating is called OK to Be Me. This is programming, broad programming for 2S LGBTQ plus youth here in Kitchener-Waterloo or Waterloo region in Ontario. And at the top, we sort of have a snapshot of what OK to Be Me is. And as you can see, these 3 program areas, 1 being counseling, 2 being youth leadership programming, and 3 being community education, it's kind of a 3-in-1 evaluation. We were evaluating OK to Be Me, but really we had to kind of plan 3 evaluations at the same time because these 3 program areas are so different. You can see here in the middle our evaluation goals. I won't go over those, but we really had to keep going back to these goals that guided our evaluation questions when we were making these methodological decisions. What do we actually need to know? Who do we actually need to talk to? What kind of data do we need to collect? All of these questions were answered by going back to our evaluation goals. And then on the bottom of this slide, you can see this was, as I said, a very complex. It had 3 different theories of change, really. 3 different logic models were included in evaluating this overarching program, which meant using a lot of different evaluation methods. So along the bottom here, I have all of the different ways that we access all different methods in order to evaluate the program. Everything from what I would consider document review, like reviewing best practice literature, doing some secondary data analysis, so piggybacking on some of the counseling pre-post outcome data that was already being collected. We didn't have to collect new data. We could just analyze the data that they were already collecting as part of their own quality assurance. And then, of course, creating some new methods in terms of interviews, focus groups, some video interviews that we did with youth at their Gay Straight Alliance conference, just as some examples. Really, we had to be creative and use a lot of different methods to kind of make sure we were getting a good snapshot of each of these 3 program areas. And again, this was happening over 2 years. And I will say this was not a very well-resourced evaluation. This is a community-based program. A lot of the people involved in the evaluation were taking this on just out of a commitment on a volunteer basis and not in a paid role. Just out of a commitment to doing this evaluation for this very important community program. So just to highlight, just to kind of focus in on one of the methodological tools that we use, which was a survey that we developed. This survey was to evaluate one of the activities that happened in that second program area, so the youth leadership programming. Each year, a group of the youth who attended the project, or the program, who were called the GSA Squad, planned a Gay Straight Alliance conference, which hosted around 200 youth throughout the region who were all involved in their school's Gay Straight Alliance. And we wanted to do a survey at the conference to see how the conference was going for folks, to look at what outcomes they were getting. In order to design the survey, one of the things that worked really well was engaging in co-design with the youth who were planning the conference. So that GSA squad I talked about, we went to a couple of their sessions. We introduced ourselves first, of course, identified why we were there, what the heck, why we were infiltrating their group, why we were asking them to share their pizza with us, and asked them to help us co-design a survey. What did they think we should ask about if we wanted to know about what are the outcomes that people get from coming to this conference, that youth are getting? How can we measure that? So they helped us to decide on 3 large areas that we would measure with the survey, including feelings, skills, and information or knowledge that people were learning at the conference. Some other things that worked were really, I mean, the main thing here is being willing to adapt our methods on the fly. So coming to these 3 buckets of things that we would measure, that was driven by the youth. We didn't come in with that plan, and we adapted as we went. Some things that didn't work was trying to do too much, asking too much of the youth sometimes, whether it was through these consultations or in other ways, just asking too much engagement. We had to really kind of find a good balance there between over-engaging the youth and really allowing them to participate. So in developing this survey, one of the consultation tools we did is we put up these 3 pieces of chart paper and asked the youth, what do you want to know about people's feelings about the conference, the skills they're working on, and the knowledge or information they're learning? And youth put these Post-its up about things they would want to know about. The team then went away and created questions to measure the things that youth were interested in measuring. And what this ended up leading to was, in this specific instance, the creation of a survey that served the needs of the youth who planned the conference and allowed us to measure the outcomes of that conference in a usable way that was feasible and that could actually be usable and would meet the needs of our evaluation and the needs of our community that we were trying to evaluate. All right, I'm going to stop talking there, and I'm going to now ask us to go back into our breakout rooms. We'll be in the same breakout rooms as before, so we can kind of build on the conversations. And I want to really dig into this methods conversation. That's what I'm hoping that we can do in this, in these breakout rooms. So the questions that we'll focus on will be, 1, what data are you already collecting? Like, what are some things that you're already doing data you're already collecting as part of your administering your project that you could maybe apply to answering some of your evaluation questions? What existing activities that you're doing lend themselves well to piggybacking on some data collection activities, things you can think about? How might you blend these qualitative or other qualitative and quantitative methods are some things you could focus on. And then finally, and this one is green because this is the thing I want us to report back on. The main thing I want us to report back on is, what methods might you use? What methods are you using to collect your data? Or which methods pique your interest of the methods I've already listed on those 2 slides, or methods that aren't listed on those slides, but what are ones that you're using or interested in? The goal of this, when we report back, when we come back as a group, is you'll report back on what methods you're using or what methods interest you, or what methods you're planning to use. And we will literally build a collective toolkit. It can be methods, like I said, that I've already listed on the slides, or other methods. We'll build a community toolkit of what methods are being used by different projects in order to kind of share that knowledge of developing or using those methods across projects and kind of get you in conversation with one another. So we will go back into, I will ask Eric to put us back into our breakout rooms. We'll be in these breakout rooms until, let me look at my timing here, 2:40. So we'll have about 15-20 minutes. We can go over by a few minutes to engage in this methods conversation before we do our report back.